Here's what I didn't expect to see in 2026. A Canadian Prime Minister standing on a global stage, looking directly into cameras, broadcasting to every corner of the planet, and essentially telling the most powerful person on earth to back off. Not with anger, not with threats, but with something far more dangerous, calm, calculated defiance. And then this happened. The backlash was immediate, brutal, unprecedented. But here's the thing nobody's talking about. It worked. Look, I've been covering North American politics for years, and what I'm about to show you changes everything we thought we knew about leveraged power and what happens when intimidation meets institutional strength. Mark Carney became Canada's Prime Minister in March 2025. Before that, he ran the Bank of Canada, then the Bank of England. This isn't some career politician. This is someone who spent decades managing economic crisis, financial systems, and global markets. Someone who understands exactly how pressure works and, more importantly, how to neutralize it. Within days of taking office, he walked into a situation most leaders would consider career suicide. Trump was already threatening tariffs, already talking about making Canada the 51st state, already using language designed to humiliate, destabilize, and force quick concessions. Most governments would have scrambled, would have softened their positions, would have offered compromises just to make the pressure stop. Carney did the opposite. But here's where it gets complicated. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about resisting for the sake of resistance. What Carney understood, what his entire approach was built on, was something most leaders miss. Intimidation only works when the target is unprepared, when they're caught off guard, when they haven't built the foundations to withstand sustained pressure. Canada had been building those foundations for months. Before tensions escalated, before the threats became public, before anyone was paying attention, trade relationships were diversified, infrastructure was strengthened, supply chains were secured, regulatory frameworks were modernized, and institutional resilience became the central priority. So when the pressure arrived, Canada didn't panic, didn't scramble for emergency solutions, didn't offer concessions just to buy time. It held its ground. Now, what I'm about to show you is why this matters beyond Canada. Why governments around the world are studying every move Carney made. Why this became a case study in modern economic diplomacy. Because intimidation is a tool, a political weapon, and for years it worked. Countries adjusted their positions. They softened their stances. They accepted unfavorable terms just to avoid prolonged conflict. But that strategy depends on one essential factor, fear, and Carney removed it from the equation. Here's what nobody expected. Despite sustained pressure, despite tariff threats, despite public confrontations, Canada preserved its trade framework with the United States. Markets stayed open. Investment continued. Supply chains kept functioning. The predicted collapse never materialized. Not because Canada gave in, but because intimidation alone proved insufficient. Wait, it gets worse for Trump. I mean, the approach didn't just protect Canada's interest. It started changing how other countries viewed their options. If Canada could absorb this kind of pressure without submission, what did that mean for everyone else facing similar tactics? Documents revealed that officials from multiple governments began reaching out to Canadian counterparts, not publicly, not through formal channels, but quietly, strategically, asking the same questions. How did you prepare? How did you maintain access without conceding sovereignty? How did you stay stable under sustained attack? This is the part that kept me up last night, because what happened next wasn't just about trade or tariffs or political theater. It was about credibility. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada was built on trust, automatic cooperation, mutual dependence. That trust was treated as a permanent feature, something that didn't need maintenance or protection. Trump shattered it. Not all at once, but systematically, through unpredictability, through threats, through treating long-standing partnerships as transactional relationships that could be renegotiated at any moment. And once that trust weakened, something fundamental changed. Canada stopped operating on assumptions of goodwill, started operating on calculation, on preparation, on institutional strength. That's not a weaker relationship. That's a more mature one, more resilient, more realistic. But that's not even the real story. January 20th, 2026, Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, where global leaders gather annually to discuss economics, policy, and the future of international cooperation. Carney walked onto that stage knowing exactly what he was about to do, knowing the consequences, knowing that every word would be analyzed, scrutinized, and weaponized. He opened in French, deliberate, symbolic, then switched to English. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. 7 words, and the room went silent. He didn't mention Trump by name, didn't have to. Every person in that auditorium knew exactly who he was talking about, what he was addressing, what rupture he meant. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Now, here's what makes this dangerous. Carney wasn't just criticizing. He was diagnosing, breaking down exactly how modern economic warfare works, how intimidation gets deployed, how pressure gets applied. And then he did something unprecedented. Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. The audience erupted. Standing ovation, not common at DVOS, not for political speeches. But this wasn't a political speech. This was a declaration, a statement that the old rules, the old assumptions, the old playbook no longer applied. Sources are now confirming what happened next. Within hours, Trump's team was scrambling. The speech had upstaged Trump's own Davos appearance, had reframed the narrative, had turned what was supposed to be American dominance into a conversation about resistance. Trump responded exactly how you'd expect: personal attacks, public humiliation. Canada lives because of the United States, he said. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. Then came the board revocation. Trump had invited Carney to join something called the Board of Peace, supposedly focused on Gaza. After Davos, that invitation disappeared, rescinded publicly, designed to send a message. But here's where it gets complicated. The message backfired because instead of looking weak, instead of appearing isolated, Carney's stock rose, not just in Canada, globally. Leaders who had been quietly uncomfortable with Trump's approach suddenly had cover, had an example, had proof that standing firm didn't automatically mean economic catastrophe. And then this happened. Reports are coming in that European officials began using language directly lifted from Carney's speech. Middle powers, strategic autonomy, variable geometry. These weren't just talking points. These were operational frameworks. The latest information shows that within weeks, multiple governments accelerated plans to diversify away from U.S. dependence. Not abandoning the relationship, but reducing vulnerability, building options, creating leverage, exactly what Carney had outlined. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Trump's response wasn't just anger, it was escalation. He threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Canada pursued a trade deal with China. Context matters here. Canada had just finalized a narrow agreement with Beijing, not a comprehensive free trade deal, just a targeted arrangement focused on electric vehicles and agricultural products designed to resolve specific trade tensions that had developed over previous years. But Trump framed it as betrayal, as Canada choosing China over America, as a direct challenge to U.S. interests. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. Notice the language. Governor Carney, not Prime Minister Governor, implying Canada is just another U.S. state, that Carney is subordinate, that Canadian sovereignty is negotiable. Carney's response was surgical. We have no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with China or any other non-market economy. What we have done is rectify some issues that developed in the last couple of years. Calm, factual, no escalation, but also no retreat. And here's what nobody's talking about. The China deal wasn't just about trade. It was about demonstrating options, about showing that Canada could engage with multiple partners, that U.S. pressure wouldn't force exclusive alignment. that Canada wasn't on the menu, it was at the table. Wait, it gets worse. Officials are now saying that Trump's threats actually strengthened Carney's domestic position. Polling data shows Canadian support for his approach increased dramatically after each Trump attack. Why? Because Canadians saw their prime minister defending sovereignty, refusing to be bullied, maintaining dignity under pressure. The more Trump pushed, the stronger Carney looked. This is classic strategic judo, using your opponent's force against them, turning their pressure into your advantage. But that's not even the most important part. Here's what I missed initially, what everyone missed. This wasn't just about one leader standing up to another. This was about institutions versus individuals. Trump operates on personality, on unpredictability, on creating chaos and forcing opponents to react emotionally. His entire strategy depends on destabilizing decision-making, on making adversaries uncertain, anxious, desperate for resolution. Carney denied him every single one of those advantages. How? By removing personality from the equation, by operating through institutions, legal frameworks, and diplomatic channels, by making the response systematic rather than emotional. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. When Trump threatened tariffs, Canada didn't issue angry statements, didn't match rhetoric with rhetoric. Instead, it activated pre-established protocols. Trade negotiators engaged with their U.S. counterparts. Legal teams analyzed treaty obligations. Economic advisors modeled impact scenarios. The response was coordinated, measured, institutional, and it completely neutralized Trump's chaos strategy. Documents reveal that Carney's team had spent months wargaming exactly these scenarios, not because they knew specifically what Trump would do, but because they understood his pattern: pressure, escalation, demand for immediate concessions, threat of economic pain, so they prepared for all of it. Trade relationships were diversified before threats materialized. Supply chain vulnerabilities were identified and addressed before they could be exploited. Legal positions were researched and documented before disputes arose. By the time Trump applied pressure, Canada's position was already locked in, already defensible, already sustainable. This is the part that kept me up last night, because what Carney demonstrated wasn't just effective crisis management. It was a completely different model of leadership. Most politicians respond to pressure by promising to fight back, by matching aggression with aggression, by performing strength through confrontation. Carney did the opposite. He performed strength through preparation, through stability, through institutional resilience, and it worked better. Now, what I'm about to show you changes everything about how we think about power dynamics. The old model of international relations assumed that bigger powers always win, that economic size translates directly into leverage, that threats from major economies automatically force compliance from smaller ones. Carney proved that model wrong, not by being stronger than the United States. Canada obviously isn't, but by being more stable, more predictable, more institutionally coherent. Wait, it gets worse for traditional power dynamics. I mean, the latest information shows that U.S. investor confidence in Canada, U.S. trade actually increased during this period, not despite the tensions, because of how Canada handled them. Why? Because markets value stability. They value predictability. They value knowing that agreements will be honored, that rules will be followed, that institutions will function regardless of political drama. Canada provided all of that. The U.S. under Trump provided none of it. So capital started treating Canada as the safer bet, the more reliable partner, the country where long-term planning made sense. This wasn't about choosing sides. This was about risk management. And Canada had become the lower risk option. But here's where it gets really complicated. Trump's pressure campaign didn't just fail to achieve its objectives. It produced unintended consequences that directly harmed U.S. interests. Supply chains weakened as companies diversified away from U.S.-dependent networks. Allied governments accelerated plans for strategic autonomy. International institutions that had relied on U.S. leadership started exploring alternative frameworks. And America's reputation as a predictable, reliable partner suffered lasting damage. Meanwhile, Canada's reputation improved. Stability became its advantage. Reliability became its currency. Institutional strength became its brand. This is what I mean when I say the old relationship has been transformed. It hasn't disappeared. But it operates on completely different terms now. Canada no longer assumes automatic goodwill from Washington, no longer takes U.S. cooperation for granted, no longer treats the partnership as permanent regardless of behavior. Instead, it operates on calculation, on reciprocity, on institutional frameworks that protect interests regardless of who occupies the White House. That's not a weaker relationship. That's a more mature one, more sustainable, more realistic. And it emerged directly from sustained pressure. Here's what nobody's talking about. The USMCA review is coming. The trade agreement that governs North America's economic integration needs to be renegotiated. And Canada now enters those talks from a position of strength it didn't have before. Not military strength, not economic size, but strategic credibility, because the world watched Canada absorb Trump's pressure without breaking. Watched it maintain sovereignty without isolation. Watched it preserve access without submission. And that credibility is worth more than any single trade concession. But that's not even the real story. So here's where we are. Carney's approach didn't just protect Canadian interests. It created a template, a playbook for how medium-sized democracies can resist economic coercion from larger powers. And governments around the world are studying it, not just studying, implementing. Reports are coming in that European officials have begun adopting similar strategies, building institutional resilience before crisis hit, diversifying dependencies before they become vulnerabilities, coordinating with allies before pressure arrives. This is what Carney meant by middle powers must act together, not forming a bloc against the United States, but creating networks of cooperation that reduce individual vulnerability to any single power. Variable geometry. He called it different coalitions for different issues, different partnerships for different challenges, different frameworks for different contexts, flexibility as strength, diversity as security, options as power. Now, what I'm about to show you is why this matters beyond international relations, beyond trade, beyond diplomacy. This is about what leadership looks like in the 21st century. For decades, we've been sold a specific vision of strong leadership. Loud, confrontational, dominant, the leader who shouts the loudest, threatens the hardest, demands the most. Trump embodies that vision perfectly. And for many people, for many situations, it looks like strength. But Carney demonstrated something different. Strength through preparation, power through institutions, influence through credibility. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't demand. He prepared. He stabilized. He delivered. And when the pressure came, when the threats materialized, when the chaos arrived, he simply stayed focused, stayed disciplined, stayed consistent. The result, Canada is still standing. Trade continues, markets function. Sovereignty remains intact. Trump achieved the opposite of what he intended. He wanted compliance. He got resistance. He wanted submission. He got independence. He wanted control. He got diversification. Because when intimidation becomes predictable, it stops working. When threats become routine, they lose power. When chaos becomes expected, it creates opportunity for those prepared to navigate it. Wait, it gets worse. For anyone who thinks this approach only works for Canada, the latest information shows that other governments facing similar pressure are reporting similar results. Preparation beats panic. Institutions beat personality. Stability beats chaos. Not every time, not in every situation, but more often than the old playbook would predict. This is the part that kept me up last night, because what we're watching isn't just a trade dispute. It's not just political theater. It's not even just about Canada and the United States. It's about whether the future of international relations is defined by coercion or cooperation, by threats or treaties, by intimidation or institutions. And the early results suggest that institutions properly strengthened and strategically deployed can withstand more pressure than anyone expected. But here's what I'm really curious about. What happens next? Trump isn't backing down. The tariff threats continue. The rhetoric intensifies. The pressure campaign expands. But Carney does not waver. He stands by his Davos speech without qualification. I meant what I said, he tells reporters. When Trump's Treasury Secretary claims Carney walked back his position, Carney rejects it outright. No apologies, no retreat, no concessions. Just calm, disciplined adherence to positions that were prepared long before the pressure arrived. And that's what makes this moment unprecedented. One of America's closest allies is openly demonstrating that U.S. pressure can be absorbed, managed, and neutralized, not through defiance or escalation, but through institutional strength and strategic preparation. And the world is watching. Governments are studying this, adapting to it, learning from it. Does this mean the end of U.S. influence? No. America remains enormously powerful, enormously important, and enormously influential. But it does mark the end of automatic deference, the assumption that pressure alone guarantees compliance, that threats are sufficient leverage. That era is fading. What replaces it is an alternative model, a proven pathway for preserving sovereignty without severing partnerships, for resisting coercion while sustaining cooperation. Carney didn't create this model through confrontation. He created it through competence, through preparation, institutional resilience, and strategic restraint. And that may be the most important lesson here. The most effective response to intimidation isn't louder threats or counter pressure. It's removing the conditions that make intimidation work in the first place. Fear, uncertainty, unpreparedness, institutional fragility. Eliminate those and pressure loses its power. So I'll leave you with this question. Does this change how you think about the relationship between preparation and power, about institutional strength versus individual dominance? Am I missing something here? Because the implications feel enormous, and I want to make sure we're reading this moment clearly. Let me know in the comments what you think comes next.